Hello and welcome to the Success Showcase. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin with the Modern Observer Group. And with me, as always, is Chip Januszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how you doing this week?
Doing great. How are you, Eric?
Doing fantastic. We've got real spring-like weather.
Yeah, and I remember to set my clock an hour ahead so I wasn't an hour late for the meeting today. So, like savings time started, light out at 7 o'clock. Good stuff.
Yeah, it's a little dark when we got up this morning, but we'll get used to it and that'll be gone shortly as we head into the change of seasons. And hopefully we'll start seeing leaves showing up on the trees again.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So we've got a special guest this week. Theresa DeGray has been on here before, but not for several years. She's also joined me on several other podcasts over the years, and I'm so glad to have her back. Theresa, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Theresa, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Theresa DeGray. I'm an attorney in Connecticut. I practice statewide. I have a physical office location in Milford, Connecticut, and I live in Orange, Connecticut with my husband and my son. And I am also looking forward to it being spring. It was still a little bit cold out there at pickup today.
Yes, it was this morning. So, as I said, Theresa's been with us before. She's an attorney specializing in bankruptcy and divorce. But between her last appearance and now, she's also become a published author. So, Theresa, why don't you tell us about your book?
So I have to make one correction just to correct the record, like we're in court. I can't say that I specialize in anything, and neither can you.
Okay.
Just to be completely ethical about the situation. So my practice areas focus on bankruptcy, divorce, and probate, sometimes some Social Security disability cases. And yes, since the last time we spoke on a podcast, I did publish a book with a few other attorneys. I wrote the book while I was on my quasi-maternity leave after I had my baby. And then it was published sometime in the beginning of 2017.
And what's the book about?
So the book is titled Tiger Tactics, and it is about strategically opening and running small to mid-sized law firms. It's written by a handful of attorneys from across the country. Three of them are from Connecticut. Me, Jay Ruane, and Ryan McKean are from Connecticut. And then Billy Tarasio and Bill, the lawman Bill, is from Florida. And we all met physically once. This was all, of course, pre-pandemic. We went down to New York City. I think it was like April. It was like around this time of 2017 or 18. We all met in person. We had a big dinner around a round table at a fancy restaurant in New York City. It was absolutely amazing to sit down with all of them after we had written the book and published it, and to get to know them personally. So we wrote the book together, but we never met each other. It's a collection of 10 essays. Each author wrote their own 10 essays. So 5 lawyers, 10 essays. You do the math. It's a collection of different essays all about how we opened our firms and how we manage and run our firms, market our firms, and help the clients along the way while we make a living doing what we love.
Fantastic. That's so important because we've talked about this over and over again with both lawyers as well as doctors. With all of the schooling you get, it's all focused on the practice of law, the practice of medicine, and there's very little that you're taught about how to run a practice.
So, interesting fact about me, Eric, is that I actually started working at law firms when I was 16 years old, and I worked for real old school town attorneys that were ingrained in the community, that had practiced for 30 or 40 years, that were quasi-public citizens, as the preamble to the Code of Conduct says. And they taught me everything I needed to know really about how to dress, how to talk to people, where to sign, what to do. And their paralegal, who became a huge mentor to me, who I'm still friends with to this day, taught me everything I needed to know procedurally about being a lawyer. And then I went to law school and I learned the theory about being a lawyer. So I learned the why and the how. But you're absolutely correct. There is nobody and nothing in law school that is going to teach you how to open a practice, how to run a practice. So years ago, Jay Foonberg wrote the seminal treatise on how to start a practice and run the practice. I believe his first book came out in 1974. I just recently found a first edition copy on a shelf in my office. The attorney that I share space with is a little bit older than me, and he has some older books. So I reached out to Jay Foonberg, who wrote this book, this amazing book, and I had it, and it was actually crumpling and falling apart. And I reached out to him and I explained this whole story to him. And he not only sent me a digital copy of the 2020 edition of the book, but he sent me this beautiful long email, and we connected and made this nice little relationship. So when I first started practicing law, there was nobody really there telling me like, this is what you do and that's what you do and all this stuff. I started right at the firm where I was a paralegal. So I went from being 16 years old to pouring coffee and getting the mail and just kind of being a sponge and observing all these people. And then I went away to law school, and when I came back, I went back to another law firm that I had been working at. And I got a job there as a first-year associate, but I didn't know my butt from my elbow. So, you just kind of learn as you go. And then eventually I went out on my own. And if I could quote a movie, you build it and they'll come. That's the quote, right? If you build it, they will come.
Yep. Field of Dreams.
Field of Dreams. Yes. So I literally, the theme of opening my own practice was, if I built it, they'll come. And I just kind of figured if I hung out the shingle and I did what I was supposed to do, and I was ethical and I just did the next right thing and the next right thing, that it would all work out and I'd be able to help some folks. So I did that. But also personally, I had a bunch of problems and I had to fix them somehow. And the way that I fixed them was I filed bankruptcy. So it was very embarrassing at the time, but somehow I took that story and I started telling people, and I started telling clients, and I started opening up about it. And they started opening up to me. And then I started practicing bankruptcy law. And that story of me filing my own bankruptcy became sort of not necessarily the theme, but it became the sort of the marketing piece or the marketing language or the marketing literature that went up on my website, my personal story. And I get, even to this day, years and years and years later, clients will call up and they'll say, I just read your story on your website and I'm going through the same thing and I need you to help me. And I want you, because you know exactly what I've been through. And I say yes, and thank you, and I appreciate it. And I'm still glad people are actually reading that. And then I help them. And they get a fresh start through bankruptcy. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And it was the best thing that ever happened to them.
No, and it's been a long time since we did the last podcast. So I had to go back to your website and fill myself back in and so on. And that whole story is right there. And obviously, being personal about what's going on there, everybody's personal. Everybody's got their problems and whatever. And your connection as a human being who cares about what they're going through, and you want to share forward what your experience is through your professional experiences, is just it's just wonderful. So as far as who your best potential clients are, I'm sure that law firms that are starting to get going are people that you can talk to. I don't know if schools are ready to invite you in to help teach their law students as far as how to get things going. But I mean, who are your target markets, and what are your strategies for getting in there? Because obviously you're dealing with two networkers here.
Yes. So my best referral source for my personal practice is other lawyers. So other lawyers do other things for clients, and they get to know the client rather intimately. It's not really like a client or a person is going to show up at your kitchen table or your conference room table and open up all about their financial woes, right? So most of the other attorneys have gone through some other process with the client, and they've sort of teed up the case for me and vetted the client and know that the client has either just gone through a horrific event, a death in the family, a divorce, had COVID, or lost a job or is facing foreclosure, or just has a ton of credit card debt. They know that because they've intimately gone through a process with that client, and now they've teed up the case, vetted the client, and they're handing them off to me. That's the ultimate referral, is a referral from another attorney. Also, I literally just get people walking in off the street. Doctors don't often get walk-ins. Lawyers do. And another kind of misnomer about lawyers is, we may not be doctors, we may not be dealing with all the time immediate life and death situations, but I'll tell you, as a lawyer, we do deal with what people consider to be life and death. If you don't have a place to live, if you don't have credit to go out and sign for a note on a car to get transportation to go to work, these are things that affect your livelihood. So doctors and lawyers were very important. I think that through the process of writing the book and practicing law, I feel like, and I don't mean to like ask for pity, but I think lawyers get a bad rap, and I think that over the course of many years, the respect for the profession has certainly waned. And I want to bring that back. I want people to understand that we do important work, and it is hard to go out there and put yourself out there. It is hard to go out there and help people and throw yourself on the mercy of the court for some other person. And that's really what we do every day in and day out. And it's just like doctors. They're dealing with the medical aspects of life and death. We're dealing sometimes with the financial aspects of life or livelihood and death. And in fact, just last week, as an attorney, I'm a conservator for somebody, and 2:00 in the morning, my phone's ringing. It's a nursing home, and one of my conserved clients was dying, and I had to get up and deal with that with the doctor, and in fact, send a fax to the probate court at 2:00 in the morning. So lots of the different things, different aspects of my life happening. But with regard to the book, the marketplace for the book, again, is other lawyers, could be law schools. We did try to send copies to all the local libraries. So, it's not just necessarily, the book is not just necessarily for lawyers starting law firms. I had a fellow BNI networker ask me for a copy of the book last week, and he's a financial guy. So he works for Edward Jones. So it does cross different professions. It is for professionals. It is mostly for professionals who are hired to provide services, not necessarily products.
Fantastic. So now, you briefly mentioned COVID as you were talking there. And just after we all went into lockdown, I made a comment to you that I was going to have to check back with you after all this was over to see how many couples you had met that during lockdown decided they couldn't stand each other anymore and had to go through divorce. Have you actually seen an uptick or a downtick in divorces?
I think that there was maybe a little blip on the screen. It wasn't really something that you could gauge because the courts shut down. I mean, they actually shut down. There was nothing happening. The exigent circumstances and the emergency orders were only for, I forget how they termed it or what they call it. I think it's a tier 1 case, which is, criminal cases. Basically, they could only have arraignments for the first couple of months of the pandemic. So the backlog of the divorce courts, what I've actually seen, Eric, to be honest with you, is not necessarily an uptick or a downtick in the divorce rate. I've seen a huge uptick in the amount of cases that have been pushed off to mediation, because it is the court recognized the mechanics of how things were working and not working, because we couldn't get into the courthouse. We didn't have the access to the justice there physically. So they created forms and processes and procedures, and they put in place different things for people to get divorced on the papers, as we call it. So that had kind of always been there for a couple of years. We had introduction of what we would call a quickie divorce a couple of years ago, where you could waive the statutory NICI period, the cool down period before you get divorced. And we used that system during COVID to bring clients through the mediation process, whether it be through a Zoom app, a Skype app, or in person in your office, 6 feet apart with masks on. I actually did a whole lot of business in my parking lot during that time. Shoving papers through windows, things like that. But we took clients through the mediation process and we got them divorced rather quickly on the papers.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term, what does mediation mean, and how is that different from a regular divorce?
Mediation is not litigation. Let's put it that way. So you have two tracks a divorce can take, and a divorce, just so everybody knows, to bring it all the way back, is a divorce is actually a lawsuit. There's a plaintiff and a defendant. Somebody actually sues somebody for divorce, and you have a lawsuit. It's Smith versus Smith, right? Now in Connecticut, you can get divorced for any reason or no reason. We live in a no fault divorce state. I don't have to prove that you cheated on my client. I don't have to prove that you broke down the relationship for my client to get a divorce. Anybody could walk into the courthouse, fill out the paperwork, and get divorced. Okay. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is when a client comes to me and says, I want a divorce, I do an intake process. And I'm not going to take you through the whole intake process. It takes about an hour to do it, but you get the point. It's an intake process. I get the basics, right? I get kind of the story of the case, and I get to determine whether or not this case would be ripe for litigation or mediation. And the way to tell, it's like a sniff test almost, is if the two parties can get along. Do they have some semblance of an agreement? Can they come and sit down at a table and open up to each other and talk to each other and talk things out with me? Can I negotiate or, have these folks negotiate with each other? Can I mediate this process for them? And if the answers to those questions are yes, 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 then maybe they can go through the mediation process successfully without court intervention. At that point, through a mediation, you can do everything from the beginning to the end without any court intervention until the absolute last second, when you put all the documents together in a nice little package, practically with a bow on top, and take it to the clerk's office and file it. And within 0 to 7 days, the clients are divorced on the papers. I just did one in February. Client called me on February 8th. They were divorced on February 28th. And they would have been divorced sooner, but there was like a little hiccup in between. So it was very quick. They had an agreement, basically. I worked out a few little things for them. I did all the paperwork, did it with the court, signed my mediation certificate, and they were divorced. I walked them into the courthouse at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. They were divorced by 9 o'clock the next morning.
Wow, that is quick.
Yes. So the other way that you can get divorced is litigation. And I'm not going to go into too much about that because we would be here until 2024. But litigation, as you can imagine, can get pretty dicey. And you don't want to get into that if you don't have to, right? It's cheaper, quicker, and easier to get a mediation. So if you can, don't fight with each other. Hire a mediator, get it all done, one flat fee, and you're divorced. Litigation can drag on for years. I have a couple of those going on right now.
So how did you come up with the name Tiger Tactics for the book?
I didn't come up with the name Tiger Tactics, Chip. I don't. Thank you. Somebody else came up with it. There was a couple of different options, I think, and maybe we all voted on it. It's a little fuzzy and vague because this all happened like right after I had that 5-year-old little boy that just walked in here and interrupted us. And there was a couple of names and a couple of, that like you have the title of the book and then you have that longer spiel, kind of what the book is about. Yeah, it ties it all in like 5 words. There was a couple of different versions of those, I think. And then somebody came up with the cover art, which is a tiger. And we all just loved the way that it looked and the way that it felt and the message that it was sending. Because, I guess we could have named it something about sharks maybe, but tiger seemed appropriate. And it's the alliteration of the T and the T, the Tiger Tactics. It all just worked out. And it's a cute little book and it's available on Amazon. And I have actually a few authors' copies that I could give away. So if you want to like do a giveaway or something and somebody wins the book, I can send them a copy and I can send each one of you a copy as well.
Fantastic. That would be great. So we'll have to figure out some sort of giveaway for that.
Yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, I do want to get a little personal.
Okay.
We have nothing to be frightened about. We have spoken on previous podcasts about the fact that you do have lupus.
Yes, I do.
That being a fairly major underlying condition, how did you cope with COVID?
Oh, so here's my COVID story. The last week of November and the first week of December 2019, I was so sick, I thought I was dying. I was so sick with something that no one could diagnose. Nobody knew what was wrong with me. I went to the walk-in 2 or 3 times. They told me I had an unidentified upper respiratory infection. They started throwing medicines at me and all kinds of stuff. It took about 2 weeks for it to course through my body and another 2 weeks to get over it. I was down for about a month, and about 2 or 3 months later, when the world locked down and we figured out COVID was COVID, it literally dawned on me I had COVID. And my hair started to fall out in March and April of 2020, which is actually a symptom of COVID-19. Or a result of it. And then from March to, I don't know, maybe, when was it? The end of 2020, I just stayed in my house. I ran my entire practice through the phone, email, Zoom, Skype, Teams, and WebEx. I did everything here in the home office where I am today. And I would go into my office on off-peak hours at night on the weekends when my son could stay with my husband and I could go in and I wouldn't really see too many people. Sorry, somebody's calling. And then eventually my son started going back to daycare and I started going back to the office. and I was fine. I got all my vaccines. I did everything I was supposed to. I wore a mask. I stayed away from people as much as I could. I required everyone that walked into the office to wear a mask. The people I shared the office space with all got COVID at some point. I totally avoided it at that point. And then my mother passed away. My mother passed away in December of 2021. And I went to see her every single day when she was in hospice for over a month. She was on a COVID floor. I never got COVID, okay? She passed away on December 28th. About a week later, on January 3rd, we had her funeral. About a week later, my husband got COVID, tested positive for COVID. And the next day, I had to call the school and say to the nurse, I'm not sending my son in today because my husband has COVID. So I'm just going to presume that my son is going to test positive, and then I'll eventually test positive. And she said to me, well, is there any way that you could isolate your son from your husband? And I laughed at her because 6 hours later, in the middle of the night, my son, who's 5 years old, woke up out of his bed and came in our bed. We don't know, we're sleeping. He comes in our bed, lays down between us, and is snuggling with us. Like, how, I think it's a little too late to isolate the two of them. So eventually my son got COVID, and then eventually I got COVID. And even though I was fully vaccinated and completely boosted, it was not a fun experience for me. And I can only tell you that I'm assuming it's because I have lupus. And no matter how many vaccines you have, and no matter how boosted you are, you still have immunocompromised stuff going on. And it's just not going to be an easy thing. So luckily, thank God, I didn't have to go to the hospital or anything like that. I took care of myself here at the house, and everything eventually went away. But basically, the entire month of January 2022, I was again stuck in the house suffering with COVID. And my husband had it, my son had it, he couldn't go to school. Every time he had a quarantine off my quarantine. He didn't go to school for 20 days. So I was in the house practicing again via Zoom, Skype, all those WebEx teams, and also teaching a kindergartner school because I had to do remote learning with him. And I was suffering from COVID. So it was very difficult. That was my COVID experience.
Yeah, the beginning of that actually sounds a lot like mine. Everybody in my house had been diagnosed. This was January 2020, so before we knew what it was. And at least the doctors were able to give you something. They just looked at us and went, yeah, you've got some unidentified virus. There's nothing we can do. Just let it go through. It's like, and it was, weeks later that we figured out what it was.
Yeah, no, I went back to the walk-in and I said, you sent me home last time saying it was a virus. There's nothing you could do for me. I'm not leaving here until you give me something. So they gave me what they must have given me, I think, a Z-Pack or something like that. And they were telling me, to do it like an inhaler and all these things. And maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, maybe it was just time, but it was, it was horrible. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And I've had lots of clients that have, suffered with COVID, with their family members, have been hospitalized, have been facing foreclosure and hospitalized for COVID. I've had a couple of elderly conserved clients die from COVID. I mean, it's affected so many people in so many ways that I don't think we'll ever really understand or know the overreaching consequences of it. And we're still not through it. I mean, everybody's like, oh yeah, mask choice, and it's warm out, go do this, go do that. I mean, we're still very careful. I still wear a mask in the office. I don't require the clients to wear a mask anymore. I leave it up to them as their choice, but I feel like it's customer service. It's a tiger tactic to wear my mask and not only protect myself, but also protect the vulnerable people that are coming into my office from me and from whatever I might possibly be carrying and giving to them. So I think it's a level of customer service. It makes me feel comfortable. I do, I still do lots of hand washing and all of those things and take all the precautions because I do have lupus and I do have a son that's 5 years old and I don't want him to get sick. So, everybody's still got to stay safe.
And we are just about out of time, but I'm going to end with something you just said. I was reminded by this. It came up in my Facebook memories that I had posted 2 years ago. Did we really need a global pandemic to convince people to wash their hands? I mean,
yeah, I know. If there was a huge, such a huge, like a campaign to get everybody to wash their hands in March and April of 2020. It was very funny. I'm sure that the people that own and operate hand soap and hand sanitizer companies are doing very well right now.
I'm sure they are. So, yeah, we are at the end of our time. So if somebody wants to get a copy of your book or if they need your services, how can they get a hold of you?
All they have to do is type in Theresa DeGray into any search bar and search engine, and multiple things come up. I'm all over the place. I'm on my website at consumerlegalservices.com, the consumerlegalservicesllc.com. Don't forget the LLC. But basically, I think I own bankruptcyattorney.com too. I think I just paid for that on GoDaddy. So you can find me in multiple locations. I'm always on my cell phone, 203-814-0600. I feel like I'm on the radio. I have to say, this is a message from a debt relief agency, and we help people file bankruptcy under the bankruptcy code.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us. Chip, what do you think is the big takeaway from this episode?
I could take up another half an hour, but thanks so much for being with us, Theresa. It's so amazing when somebody shares their story and pays it forward with what they're doing with their lives. And obviously you've been through a lot and you do so much as far as what your services are and helping other people too. So thanks so much for being here with us today. Stay healthy and keep those Tiger tactics working forward.
Thanks so much, Chip. You guys take care too. And we can always do a part 2 if you want.
We will be sure to have you back. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch us every week at xvadio.com/podcasts. You can also find us, as well as the rest of the Xvadio Podcast Network, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Audible, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. We'll see you then.